Let's get to Theology Thursday. We're going to share with you a presentation that I made at a conference that I presented to virtually recently on Romans 13. What does Romans 13 mean, and what doesn't it mean? Since today is the theme of the day today is defiance, taking back our power, our authority as we the people, and ending these lockdowns by our own actions and not waiting for government decrees. Today's a good day to play this presentation, and then afterwards, Todd and Aaron will react. Here it is. Hi, I'm Steve Deace. Thank you for joining me for this presentation titled 6 Things Romans 13 Does and Doesn't Say, and what every believer needs to know for the first post-Christian generation in American history. Let's begin with what Paul writes in Romans 13. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Given what's going on in our country these days, there's a lot of stinking thinking going on about what Paul does and doesn't mean in these words that he writes in the book of Romans. And he is uniquely qualified to address this subject in a civic manner because he was a rarity in the first century, both a Jew and a Roman citizen. I'm guessing it's a very small percentage of individuals who checked both of those boxes. Both a Jew and held in esteemed company, so he could be welcomed with open arms into every synagogue within the empire, but also as a Roman citizen, he was free to visit all of those places. He was free to be the apostle to the Gentiles as well. A unique combination. He also had some form, albeit proto versions of a lot of the freedoms we have, but he did have some nascent form of civil liberties as a first century Roman citizen as well. And we see in the book of Acts, for example, him invoke those civil liberties in order to both defend his freedom, but also to advance the gospel. So he's uniquely qualified to address the dilemma that we as American believers face in this particular era, a post-Christian era, the first one really in American history. So let's dive into this. Let's look at what Paul does and doesn't say in these verses, one by one, beginning with this first and most important point. Romans 13 does not mean do everything government tells you. And you know this by looking at how Paul himself lived out his own teaching and what happened to him as a result. When trying to explain the principle of headship in the home to my own daughters, I explained it to them this way. If I asked mom to join me in a drug dealing business, should she do it? I am the head of the home. Should she submit to me and join me in Breaking Bad? And the girls, when they were small, would kind of chuckle and say, no, that's dumb, Dad. That's silly. Well, you need sometimes to illustrate absurdity by pointing out the absurd, right? And that means there's a chain of command. That I might be the authority in the home as the husband and the father, but I am not the ultimate authority. There is a higher authority. And that higher authority says, don't be a drug dealer, all right? So, should my wife submit to me if I ask her to do something that violates God's command? Or should she submit to God? The answer, of course, is the latter. The same thing applies here. And you can tell that that's what Paul means by the way he lives this out himself. I know we live in this era of reconstructionism and reductionism. And we live in this era of Bible studies where we ask each other banal questions like, well, what does that verse mean to you? Nothing. No one should care what it means to me. I didn't write it. They should only care what it means. All right? So Paul gets to determine the context here. He's its author, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And what do we know from tradition about the end of Paul's life? Nero decapitated him. Why did he do that? Probably because Paul wasn't willing to do everything Nero, who was a notoriously vile, cruel, inhumane Caesar. Probably because Paul was not willing to do absolutely everything that Nero commanded. If he were, there was no reason to execute, to martyr Paul. So you know from Paul's own life, the times he was in chains, the times he was imprisoned, the times he was accused, sometimes falsely, the times that he was ultimately executed. You know from his own life that he didn't mean here, do whatever government tells you to do, no matter how damnable and dumb. That brings us to our second point we want to look at here about Romans 13. Romans 13 is therefore a civic application of a universal biblical truth / creed that is stated repeatedly throughout the scriptures. We are to obey God and not man, to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to render unto God that which is God's. Paul even closes with his own variation of this at the end of the scriptures we looked at in verse 8. Respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Do not give a civic ruler respect and honor that goes to God alone. Do not put cultural custom above Christian doctrine and say, well, I'm just following Romans 13. No, you've actually bastardized Romans 13. You're following the world, not the way. No, we are to obey God and not man. This is repeated constantly and consistently throughout the scriptures. We are not to, when in Rome, do as the Romans. We're to be a holy, peculiar, set-apart people. There's to be something distinct and different about us. And one of the main things that should be different about us is we live in this life as if we are citizens of another kingdom. Point 3 in our 6 things every believer needs to know about Romans 13 and what Romans 13 does and doesn't say. The purpose of government is to punish evil in order to protect the righteous. Paul writes, the state, the government, is to be an avenger. Another translation says an avenging angel. He does not brandish the sword in vain, meaning it's not to be wasted. He is to wield it. It's there for a purpose, and that purpose is to punish evil in order to protect the righteous. That's why Paul says, don't run afoul of the law, if you can avoid it, of course. Sometimes you can't because the law itself is immoral. But when the law isn't immoral, don't be immoral in violating the law. Otherwise, that sword will be brandished against you. Even as a believer, you will not be immune from that justice. When you break the natural law, it breaks you. And that is the role of government. It is not here to play referee. It is not here to determine what is fair. It's not here to determine what is right or wrong, but to enforce that which was right and wrong predetermined before it. That is the role of government. And by doing so, by punishing criminals rather than letting them go because they might have coronavirus to go who knows where, that's not government's role. Government's role is to protect you from those criminals, not release them into the gen pop. Number 4, government is every bit as accountable to God as the governed. Since it's instituted by God, appointed by God, permitted by God, therefore it is accountable to God. God is no respecter of persons, the scripture says. The heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. He, she, they, every bit is accountable to God, as are you. There is no divine right of kings or special dispensation for people whose opening line when they meet you is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Quite the opposite. History is replete with examples that the same total depravity that threatens each and every one of we mere mortals is especially temptable to those with all of that power and access to other people's money. No, government is every bit as accountable to God as are the governed. Point 5. In our country, we the people formed the Union and the Constitution that guides and governs us. And our politicians are public servants who only govern by our consent. So we are not to submit to them as much as they are to submit to us. Therefore, in the case of these United States, we the people are the instituted authority that God has appointed. This is one of the major sticking points I see a lot of American believers and pastors get wrong. Well, I have to shut down my church because blank, because government told me to. Well, I have to bake the cake blank because government told me to. Wrong. You are the authority, as am I. We the people, we are the authority. It has derived its powers from us. God has permitted this unique structure that we call Republican form of government or democracy. We the people formed the Union. We the people ratified the Constitution. We the people go to vote. Remember, I said earlier, Paul had sort of proto versions of the civil liberties we have today. Well, what Paul did not have was a representative form of government. That's what we get to have. We elect proxies. They are to govern on our behalf. We have referendums on their success or lack thereof. These are called elections. We get to remove them, sometimes even sooner, sometimes for a criminal action or an impeachment or a recall of some kind. No, all of the ultimate accountability in our system resides with the people, not with the politicians. We don't submit to them. They submit to us. This is not a king-servant relationship, a king-subject relationship. This is a citizen-public servant relationship. And that, when you understand that, you learn two things. Number one, why this country has been a huge promoter of religious freedom, both within its borders and across the globe until recent times. And that has been to the benefit of the Christian church because it recognized that government is not God, God is God. But then two, you recognize why we've lost so much of our freedom and liberty, and our religious freedom is so imperiled right now as well, because we have given up the premise of our government. We've abrogated our authority. We've done what is wise in our own eyes, as opposed to letting our yes be our yes and our no be our no and keeping our vow and saying, hey, we're serious about this responsibility, serious enough to hold politicians who violate their oaths of office, to hold them accountable. And yet in this country, over 90% of incumbents get reelected in every election. So the same people that like to complain all the time about corruption in politics will often then just turn around and vote for the same people they were just complaining about. That is not the fault of the political process. God says to the prophet Ezekiel, hey, when the people sin, they're guilty of their own sin, but you that were appointed watchmen on the wall, you're guilty too. You didn't warn them. You didn't impart to them what I told you to say. You didn't hold them accountable. Well, in our country, we are those watchmen on the wall. The final point to make about Romans 13. As we enter into America's first post-Christian generation, every believer needs to be prepared to tell government no. You will not stand down on the gospel to appease your cultural customs or your authoritarian decrees, just as Paul did. Some of you may be unsure. Boy, could I really say no when they tell me I have to teach my kids that Heather has two mommies, that there's such a thing as 57 genders? Some of you may not be sure, boy, when they show up at my bakery, can I resist, or my floral shop? Well, I bring you glad tidings of great joy to close out our conversation here today. If you as a believer are unsure of whether or not you have the courage of conviction to say to government at some point when it wants to violate your conscience and get you to do that which God says is wrong, if you're unsure whether you can tell government no or not, the good news for you today is you're going to find out. Because in the post-Christian generation in which we live, straddling the fence will not be tolerated. You will be made to care. You will give a yes or you will give a no. You will, each and every one of us in this era in which we live, the system will demand that we choose ye this day. And so does God.